This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. On this episode, we welcome Associate Professor of Social Ethics at Iliff School of Theology, Dr. Miguel de la Torre. In this podcast, we discuss his book, Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Christians. This manifesto is an evangelical book reaching out to and seeking the salvation of people of color who carry the weight of indignity, whose very humanity has been denied by whiteness.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square, and we intersect with you because you are good enough to click a button and listen to our podcast, and we are thankful for that. And my name is Rob Henderson, and I'm the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
Greater guy you won't find. I'm Kevin George. I'm from St. Aidan's Anglican Church, northwest corner of the city.
My name is Ian. I'm a content creator and the person who sends this out into the world.
All right. We are the Vicar's Crossing podcast. So guys, we had a great season so far. It just continues to get better. We are looking forward to welcoming our guest today. Thrilled to welcome activist and award-winning author Dr. Miguel de la Torre. One of his current books is called Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers. We like that.
I like it.
And this book is a real tour de force, following up on his earlier book, Burying White Privilege. The book tackles timid white liberalism and calls for reclaiming of the revolutionary ways of Jesus. And Dr. de la Torre will be joining us in a moment.
Very uncomfortable read, a necessary read for all of us. You're going to be blown away by Dr. de la Torre. He's amazing. Before we go any further, we want to acknowledge that the land upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and with whom we wish to work towards reconciliation and right relationship.
And as always, we are very thankful and want to say hello to our sponsors here on the Vicar's Crossing podcast, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. Our thanks and a big shout out to Dave Mullen and everybody at A. Miller George today.
Fantastic. And how can I not say thank you to Carol Basada? In fact, I was in the pharmacy today to pick up my Shingrix vaccine because I'm now over 50, guys. I got to get the shingles vaccine.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, they don't know. I don't know what's in it, so I don't know if I should take it, but I'm going to take it anyway.
Tiles.
Roofing tiles, like shingles. Yeah, nicely done. I see what you did there. So she whacked me in here with some shingles vaccine today, but I went in and I saw Carol back off of her mat leave, excited to be back into business, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Go see Carol Basada at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy today, folks.
And last, but certainly not least, we want to say a big, huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was a human being who is wonderful, who's out there, who hooked us up with that one. So big thank you to them over there. Booyah.
Thumbs up. This season is coming to a close in a few weeks, but that does not mean that there are not other seasons ahead of us into the new year. And Kevin, it's time now to ask you, my friend, who in the world did we book this week on the Vicar's Crossing?
Well, am I ever glad you asked? Because we did book somebody. Is there a drum roll? There's a drum roll. And I am excited to say we have booked Danielle Tumamino Hansen who is a feminist writer, practical theologian, Episcopal priest, and mom. And she has written this incredible book, which I have right here, which is called Conceiving Family, a Practical Theology of Surrogacy and Self. So we'll look forward to welcoming her in a new year in season, what, 5? What is
Six.
this? 6, season 6.
I don't know. I've lost count. It's just
That's all right.
it's been clicking along so well that
Yeah.
I don't even keep count anymore.
There you go.
It's like having kids. Once you get to 6 or 7, it's like I don't know how many.
Oh, we need to have a big party when we hit like 500 episodes or something.
I think so. I
Yeah,
think so.
Gotcha.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, well, that's great. We'll look forward to that and much, much more. But today we are looking forward to talking to our guest, Dr. De La Torre, and he is in the waiting room. So let's bring him in and we'll start our conversation on the Vickers Crossing podcast.
Awesome.
And we are so happy today on the Vickers Crossing podcast to welcome in our guest, Dr. Miguel De La Torre, joining us in our Zoom room and on our podcast. And Miguel, thank you so much for being with us. How are you today?
I'm doing great, and it's my pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you. And now, so just so we can kind of place where you are and our listeners know, tell us where you live and where you're on Zoom with us today.
Well, I'm at my home in Colorado, Denver, Colorado. I teach at the Iliff School of Theology, which is also here in town.
All right.
Very
So
good.
is it ski season yet? It's not ski season yet, is it?
Not yet. I think it maybe has snowed in the mountains, but
Yeah,
we're in the
okay.
valley, so
We're a little white
don't
here
get no
today.
snow.
We're a little white
Yeah,
here
we
today.
got a little snow today, but
Yeah.
we're in Canada, right? So
Yeah.
Oh.
July, it's snowing. But anyway, no, we're so glad you're here today. We want to get right into your book and some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But before we get into your book, Miguel, I thought it'd be helpful for people and our listeners here in Canada to learn a little bit more about your faith journey. We know you're born in Cuba and just months before the Castro Revolution, and you came to the United States with your family as a refugee when you were just 6 months old. But before becoming an activist, theologian, professor, you had a very successful business. You dabbled in politics, from what I understand. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about, shifting from owning a real estate firm to attending a Southern Baptist theological seminary, and where that journey has taken you now. What was that like for you? And share a bit of that journey.
Of course. Well, as you mentioned, we came to this country as refugees and lived in extreme poverty in Hell's Kitchen, New York, when it was Hell's Kitchen.
Wow.
The tenement building we lived in had 1 bathroom per floor.
Wow.
So one of the things I wanted to do was go to college, and of course there was no opportunity for me. And secondly, I didn't want to be poor anymore. I actually wanted things like food and clothes.
Yeah, of course.
Novel. How novel of you.
Novel idea.
Yes.
So at 18, I began. I got my real estate license. We were living in Miami at the time, and at 19, I began a real estate company. I was among the youngest brokers in the state of Florida. I was very much engaged in right-wing conservative politics, running for the Florida House in '88 under the Pat Robertson ticket.
Wow.
With the idea of saving America for Jesus.
Oh man, oh man. I would have never guessed this, by the way. When I saw in the stuff that it said you dabbled in politics, I didn't see that coming. You and Pat Robertson, I would pay to watch. That's a pay-per-view right there. I'm sorry for interrupting, but you just blew my mind. Go ahead.
No problem. So again, I was a capitalist running a real estate company quite successfully. I ran for office. I lost my election, and I went ahead and decided to go to seminary, get my theological education, and then return to Miami and run for office again. But this time really merging the Christianity and politics. And while I was in seminary, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary was going through a fundamentalist takeover, which didn't bother me. I was fine with it. It was about time. However, while taking some of the theology classes, reading Karl Barth, reading Brunner, reading all these great German thinkers, didn't do anything for me. It just made things more confusing. So I went to the library and I decided to pull books that had Latino sounding names. not knowing who Gustavo Gutierrez was, not knowing who Sabino was, not knowing who Boff was.
Right.
And I started reading these books, and I had a second born again experience.
Wow.
Only this time it was really beginning to understand my poverty when I was growing up, and how, you know, the success I had in real estate wasn't necessarily the answer to issues of poverty in the United States. I pastored a small church. After less than a year, they ran me out of town for the things I was preaching. Realizing I would never go back into politics as a conservative, and realizing no church would ever hire me, I did what every unemployed grad student does, and I went and got my Ph.D.
Of course.
Continue my education. Since then, I went to teach at a very conservative college, which also ran me out of town for an article I wrote.
You've been run out of town a lot, Miguel.
I wrote an article defending SpongeBob's sexual orientation, and Dobson attacked me and went ahead and got me pushed out of my position. If you ever want to have fun, Google De La Torre, Dobson, and SpongeBob SquarePants.
We're definitely my reading tonight. We get off here,
Since then, I've been teaching at Iliff, which is probably one of the most leftist, liberal theological schools in the country. And you know, over the years, I've been really working to try to undo the damage I did as a young political person. So when I talk about issues like in this book that deals with politics, that deals with nationalist Christianity, I'm not speaking as some egghead in an ivory tower.
Right.
I'm speaking from actual experience, from things that I myself was involved in pushing this white Christian nationalist agenda.
Yeah, well, you know, I got to say, I mean, I've come upon you in your present iteration, right? So I would have never expected the Pat Robertson thing and a conservative Christianity bit. I didn't know that part of your history. So that really, lends even more insight into the stuff you've been writing in this book. And by the way, like, do you have you've pushed out like 3 or 4 of these this year, haven't you? Like, I mean, this is one book.
Yes, this year I think I've published a total of 6 books.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So I mean,
some of them are small like that one, written for general audience. Some are more academic, like a book I wrote on Jose Marti, which is a university press book.
Yes, and there's a great book I don't know if you edited articles about water.
Yes.
Yeah. Remind me the title.
Going to trouble the water, environmental racism and water. Yeah. It was a conference I put on connecting environmental racism with water issues globally.
Yeah, fantastic work, all of it. Look, I was really disturbed by this book, as anybody who is the privilege of whiteness and white supremacy should be disturbed by reading this book. You warn us at the outset in this reading that if we purchased a book hoping to learn how to fix our complicity in racism, we've wasted our money. So then you go on to say in the introduction or in the first chapter that the book was not written directly to white folks. The book was written to those who are among the least of these, yet who remain precious in the eyes of God. Quoting from your introduction, you write these words: "Devotees of the dominant nationalist Christianity are known by the God of creation. Let me try that again. Devotees of the dominant nationalist Christianity are not known to the God of creation, for they instead have clung to the illusion of God as the God of white supremacy. Therefore, if you read this book enfolded in whiteness, please note the following trigger warning. You will feel anxiety, defensiveness, anger, shame, discomfort, and stress. Some of you are likely to defend your actions, rushing to assert we're really good people in spite of it all. But if you can work past your defense mechanisms, you will have the rare opportunity of hearing how communities of color speak amongst themselves when whites are not in earshot. You will have the rare privilege of eavesdropping on our conversation and looking over our shoulders to overhear perspectives you might never have imagined. What you do with all of that is totally up to you. Whether you choose liberation from racial sins is totally your choice. But as I said, your salvation is not the primary concern nor the purpose of this book. You go on to say that this book is, to an extent, an evangelical book reaching out to and seeking the salvation of peoples of color who carried the weight of indignity, whose very humanity has been denied by whiteness, as a call to those who are weary of racism and heavily burdened by ethnic discrimination. You say it's really an effort to demonstrate how dispossessed communities have believed the lie of white supremacy. I have to say to you, having read the book, I can testify to feeling anger and shame, discomfort, guilt. All of those things are very real. And I also felt it was necessary for me to read every word. So I thank you for this book. I think your description of having the perspective of listening in on a conversation or eavesdropping was a really good sort of metaphor for this in a way. And I think that proved helpful for me. Can you say more about this, the focus of this manifesto? Because those words are so powerful.
I think several things were going on when I wrote that. The first thing is this idea of code switching. In other words, when people of color are speaking or in the presence of white people, they have to self-discipline what they say. Because the last thing that they want is to be accused of playing the race card or being an angry Latino or, just, watching out for self-interest. So in a way, there's a policing that goes on whenever people of color enter into conversations dealing with issues of race and ethnic discrimination in where white people are involved. I did not want to do that. I did not want to do any kind of code switching. I did not want to be apologetic. I did not want to try to make white people feel good. So that was not my intention. And secondly, all too often when we deal with these issues, the audience is always a white audience. It is, and therefore, everything is geared to meet the needs of that audience. I wanted my audience to be other people of color who are struggling with these issues, but really don't have a place in which to have these conversations. We do have these conversations, but we have it among ourselves. So I was trying to find that space and write in that space. And I think the third thing that was going on is that for many people of color, myself included, as I mentioned in my earlier life history, our minds are so colonized that we become the advocates of the very structures that causes our oppression. So I mentioned I was a right-wing fundamentalist Christian Republican. In other words, you don't need oppressors when I do the job of the oppressors for them. So the other thing I wanted to do was raise the consciousness of people of color to demonstrate how we become our worst enemies when we see ourselves and define ourselves through the eyes of the dominant culture. And maybe this is a good place to just quickly make a quick disclaimer to those who are watching this podcast. When I say white, I am not talking about skin pigmentation. And that's very important. There are many people of color who are white. In other words, they defend white supremacy like I used to do. So whiteness is an ontological state of mind in where there are people, whiteness is anyone, regardless of race or ethnicity, who become defenders of white supremacy.
I think Clarence Thomas comes to mind. I think you mentioned him later in the book as well. It's a good example of somebody who's just sort of holding up all those structures,
Exactly. And he's a good example. And there are many others like Clarence Thomas as well in the Latinx community, in the Asian American community, in the indigenous community.
So in the book, you make the case that, and you mentioned preachers like James W. Fifield and Billy Graham, in their rallying against all liberal social programs like the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the New Frontier, the Great Society. We're all part of a watershed moment, making white Christianity and capitalism kind of soulmates in white America's imagination. And it was from that point forward that America is introduced to this phrase, under God. And it is after the rise of these religious leaders and business people like Doug Coe, that by 1954, the words under God were actually added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the slogan that we hear so much and know so well, in God we trust, was added to paper currency. And not long after that, we see the rise of a white conservative movement called the moral majority, which we know was neither moral nor a majority. The glue that holds all this together was and continues to be, you say, white supremacy. The scaffolding that holds all of this up is fear. Teaching and preaching fear of the other has always been devastatingly effective. So can you talk more about the second half of the last century and this rise, of white Christian nationalism that we've seen?
Of course. But before I get to the second half, I do need to at least give a little bit of context that white supremacy has always been part of the conquest of the Western Hemisphere. White supremacy is what is responsible for the genocide of indigenous people, the enslavement of African people, the invasion of Latin American countries. So it didn't just begin in the second half of the last century. However, something very important happened then that I think really gives us our modern interpretation of this white nationalist Christianity. And as you know, in the 1930s, we were going through a Great Depression. And many of the business leaders, at the time, the heads of the titans of industry, of General Electric, of General Motors, of Sears, of these major corporations, were feeling the heat by the public as being the cause of the Great Depression. It was their greed that led to this horrific economic crisis in this country. So about 1940s, when they gathered in New York City for a conference, Fifield, who you mentioned, is asked to give a sermon. And in his sermon, what he says is that the titans of industry are not the cause of the Great Depression, but rather are the saviors of this country. And that what we need to do is support ministers who would preach this salvation from the pulpits. And at that point, these corporate leaders poured money into religious organizations and religious personalities that would look towards capitalism as being a God-ordained form of economics. And they were very successful. I mean, Fifield was pushing this idea that we are under God. And at that point, it becomes part of the of our monetary system. It becomes part of our Pledge of Allegiance, this merging of politics and religion. Shortly afterwards, Eisenhower, with a lot of these same people, begins the Presidential Breakfast Club.
Yes.
I'm saying it wrong.
The National Prayer Breakfast, President's Prayer Breakfast, right?
And the idea is to bring all these leaders together to pray for the government. But what ends up happening, it becomes a who's who of the political leaders of the nation. Now, this goes on, obviously, in where corporate America provides the money for these religion organizations to gain political power. And in return, these religious organizations support the business interests.
Right.
But now we're seeing that in the last couple of years begin to split.
Right.
In where the business interests who once could control the religious interests can no longer control them, as populist leaders like Trump are rising, also attacking corporate America as well.
That's right.
So the Frankenstein that they created
this
in the 40s is now loose upon society. So this whole evolution of what we today call Christianity in this country is really a nationalist, at best a nationalist ideology, at worst a cult.
Right. It's blasphemous. I mean, like, it really truly is blasphemous that the corporations are to God, sort of, so to speak, and I guess the only ones that really fit in America now, in Trump's America, is My Pillow guy, right? Oh, geez, I really think they stole the election. So, just My Pillow. But it's just craziness. I mean, the stuff we watch from this side of the border is like watching a blood sport you guys have going on over there. Really, it's crazy.
It is wild what's going on here, but my fear is that it is this white supremacy ideology that may soon cross into the borders into your own land, as well as lands throughout the world.
So on that, I mean, the thing is that one of the struggles we've talked a lot on this podcast about, one of the things we're all trying to come to grips with, our own complacency and complicity in all of this as beneficiaries of white privilege. But we're unearthing graves of indigenous children here that died in school, in residential schools, which were nothing more than places of abuse. I mean, we have all of our own dirty laundry on this side of the border, make no mistake. But the politics, particularly, is seeping over. Like in our last election, we had a party that used the slogan "Take Canada Back." Now that sounds eerily familiar to make America great again, right? So it's taking it back for whom,
and from whom.
And from whom, So I think that when we begin to mine down with that stuff, we see that those who are have been marginalized and pushed aside and displaced from their own lands and so on are those who suffer the most. And we begin to see that. And you point this out in the book as well, that when a crisis comes along, like COVID-19 and like a pandemic, we begin to see that those who pay the highest price are those who are most marginalized. You write in the book about the devastation of COVID-19 and the mismanagement of it all by your previous president. And we know that the effects were disproportionately hard on marginalized community. The lack of paid sick leave, along with inadequate or no health insurance, made the United States the world's epicenter of COVID-19. You write these words in the book. The United States has achieved first place standing in one area: death. Whether we mean death caused by a lack of affordable health care or death by an abundance of weapons, we as a nation who claim to follow the giver of life remain faithful to the Prince of Death. This death is not restricted to bodies of color, since the corporate greed of the 1% is truly colorblind. You point out that in 2017-18 fiscal year, the U.S. spent $649. I got to just stop for a second and take a breath here, because this is a big number. $649 billion on its military. Now, get this. You point out this is more than China, Saudi Arabia, India, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and Germany spent combined. Like not either one of them, but combined. We can provide butter. We can't provide butter. Or we can provide butter, but we choose bullets, is what you say, which I thought was just brilliant. If indeed this is a nation under God, you write, then this white God suffers from toxic masculinity, which seduces white men and women. This God is a prig who makes differential option for the instruments of war and death rather than the care of human flourishing. This white God of death will continue reigning because his devotees are quick to vote for a lower quality of life rather than sharing the goods and benefits of society with fellow citizens of color. I found this particular point really interesting from at least a Canadian perspective, because we have the same thing happening here, different levels, different things. But the one that struck me is just those numbers, because we live in a country with nationalized medicine, right, where there's medicine for everybody. And seeing our neighbor, this great nation with all this wealth, enough to spend $649 billion on the military, can't provide healthcare, or won't provide healthcare is a better way to say that, won't provide healthcare, basic healthcare for its citizens. And we can see that even a fraction of that would make a difference. Can you say more about what drives the electorate to continue to vote against their own interest? Because, you make the point in here several times, as you do in this quote that I just read, that it's not only people of color who suffer this. The 1% don't give a crap about the white yokel locals who think they're voting for, like Trump sitting on his gold toilet seat gives a shit about some guy in the Midwest. Come on. So why vote against your own interest? Can you say more about that?
I think one of the things that the Republican Party has successfully mastered is the use, and I'm using the word master purposely here,
Yeah.
is the usage of fear. I mean, look at the past elections. I mean, back in the 80s, it was the fear of immigrants crossing the border. In the 90s, it was the fears of gay people who were going to make you gay if Democrats were elected. It became then the fear of blacks, and we build more prisons. You know, fears now of swarms of hordes of brown people from Central America coming up in the last election. Now for this election, we're gearing up the fear of critical race theory.
Right.
And we saw it successfully win the election for the governor of Virginia. So this usage of fear has really motivated people to really vote against what is their best interest. That's the first thing. The second thing is, throughout this country's history, whenever people of color were to receive the same benefits of white people, they would rather not enjoy those benefits than share it with people of color.
This is the one I found interesting.
We saw that during the civil rights movement, when laws began to be passed that Black people can use the public pools in southern towns. Instead of desegregating the pool system, they just poured concrete into the pool and made it into a park, and no one now enjoy. So white people in the South who would enjoy going to the pool on a hot summer day, would rather not do that than to share that pool with Black people.
Wow.
So there's this idea of cutting off your nose, literally, to spite your face. So that's a second thing that's going on. And thirdly, when the vast majority of the world resources flow to the global north, specifically the United States, that uses more resources than any other per capita, than any other nation in the world, you need a tremendous military to make sure those goods continue to flow in this direction.
Right.
So there is really no hope that we're going to change these structures.
Right. I just a quick follow up on that, and over to you, Rob. But I just wanted to say, when I hear you say that at the end, there's no hope to fix these structures. One of the things that's resonating is at some point last year, I read a perfect time to read this book in the middle of a pandemic was Embracing Hopelessness, and which is a book of Miguels, which was also tough, but it was that thing of like, these are tough subjects, and sort of having to have this middle class white sort of, just we'll hope for betterness is in some way a way of disregarding the real pain that so many experience too, that these are difficult things that we have to sit with.
Right. So let's continue with that category of something that may be hard to hear, difficult hearing. I want to offer a quote from the book and ask you today about empty gestures and expressions of pity. And you write this in the book. Unfortunately, whenever issues of justice, reconciliation, salvation, or liberation are explored, they are elucidated from the perspective of present power structures. Such simple-minded studies usually lead white churches or white denominations to offer public repentance for their racism, asking for public forgiveness, making symbolic changes, and encouraging public reconciliation for past racist sins. And we certainly are familiar with that, definitely. But you're right, these are empty gestures that seek mainly to soothe the guilt of white souls without changing or challenging the privileges that are embedded within white bodies. These gestures focus on how whiteness can feel good about itself without forsaking any of the advantages with which it is associated. This Euro-American Christianity reduces acts of justice, reconciliation, salvation, or liberation to an expression of pity for the unfortunate who need charity. and such paternal expressions of disingenuous contrition change nothing. Euro-American Christians prefer nothingness over and against disenfranchised people themselves, seizing the power to define justice, reconciliation, salvation, and liberation. For if they do, then radical political, economic, and social changes become prerequisite to establishing a new social order. That's very powerful. And this certainly falls into that category of those who think that it's difficult, as we said, like us white woke crowd who want to rush into making everything better and just fix it, so we can lay our head in the pillow at night and say, didn't we? Wasn't it good of us to enter into that? Can you say more about this paternalism, Miguel, and the ways it not only accomplishes nothing, as you talk about, but also gets in the way of what is real progress and what is really needed?
Absolutely. Like I said, I teach at a very liberal institution. And every so often, some of my students come up to me and say, "Oh, Dr. De La Torre, let's all go get arrested for this cause here or that cause." And I'm like, I'm a Latino man. I don't have to go try to get arrested.
Yeah,
That's funny.
But what they're trying to do is to gain their streets creds.
Yeah.
In other words, I got arrested. And therefore I must be good. See, I'm down with the cause. But nothing changes. If anything, things have gotten worse by getting arrested, because now money has to be spent to keep somebody out of jail, instead of spending that money on the cause that you're fighting for to begin with.
Right.
So, and just as a side note, we really are the only country, and I would include Canada here, we're the only countries in where you can drive to a march.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
So,
drop me off. I got a march.
Drop me off. I got a march to do.
So there's this idea of change being domesticated, so that we have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality.
That's right. That's
True.
right.
This is all very true.
Wow.
We basically have created a structure in where we could carry our signs and we could protest and feel good about ourselves with nothing at all changing. And these are the liberals. The conservatives, on the other hand, are more into apologizing for this sin of racism and finding some Black person to go ahead and accept their apology, and then they hug and kiss, and that's it.
Well,
all's well, and then they vote for another administration that reinforces the very same oppressive structures that they're apologizing for.
Wow.
So I guess what I'm trying to do in this book, and not just me, I think many scholars are doing this as well, is really moving away from this idea of needing to apologize for bias and prejudice feelings. I could care less what a person's feelings are, their bias or not. That's unimportant to me. Advancements will occur when we instead work to change the very structures that are bias and prejudice for individuals.
Right.
And people, if somebody wants to be a bigot, I could care less. But let's change the structures that allow their bigotry to be reinforced and enforced within the social milieu.
Like a real restitution too, right? So you're right about that. Like, it's one thing to be sympathetic to the cause of Latinas or Latinx people who are coming north, but without dealing with the stolen lands and the stolen industries and it all is pointless. There's a reason there are thousands of people at the border.
Oh, absolutely. For example, I'm a Cuban.
Yeah.
The reason I am in this country is because of gunboat diplomacy and the establishment of my country as a banana republic in the first half of the 20th century. 90% of all my sugar, of my rum, of my tobacco, the three necessities of life, literally went to the United States. These were our raw materials and our cheap labor that helped build this empire. So when one country builds roads into another country for the express purpose of stealing their raw material and their cheap labor, we shouldn't be surprised that those of us in those countries take those same roles, following everything that has been stolen from us.
Yeah.
So when the dominant culture in their good Christian ideology starts talking about, these poor, immigrants, we need to show the virtue of hospitality.
Yeah.
It is my raw materials and cheap labor that built this house.
Right.
I don't want your hospitality. I want my house back.
Yes.
So we should be talking about issues of restitution. What do we owe?
Right.
These are immigrants.
Yeah.
For all we have stolen from them. What do we owe Africans for all the labor we have stolen from them?
Right.
What do we owe indigenous people for all the land we have stolen from them?
Right. That's a big one in this country. It's like, we talk a lot about truth and reconciliation. There's a whole commission, but nobody yet is talking about restitution. And until we get there, it's a bit of an empty conversation.
My dear friend, Tink Tinker, who is one of the leading indigenous scholars of this country, likes to say we could talk about reconciliation when there's land on the table.
That's right. That's right.
When we start returning land, then we could have a conversation.
Ante up, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sometimes folks get the mistaken impression that racism and discrimination are a byproduct of a lack of education. You make it clear in your book just what a myth that is, and you write, "The educated may talk the talk, but they, like their skinfolk who suffer from a deficiency of intellectual aptitude, fail to walk the walk. Their education merely facilitate the ability to better rationalize their biases. These sophisticated racists are more treacherous to communities of color than their less educated, Confederate flag-waving, redneck skinfolk. Excuse me. While people of color can better plan to protect themselves from those who blatantly express race-based stereotypes, they find it more difficult and dangerous to safeguard against courteous racist allies. Is it any wonder people of color do not fully trust their so-called white allies, especially well-educated white allies?" Could you talk more about these like educated white allies and how they sort of affect the system, I guess is the right word, but maybe it's not.
I am more afraid of white liberals than I am of white conservatives. Because the white conservative, I know where they're coming from.
That's right.
And many times as a conservative, I could point to the gospel and say, look, Jesus doesn't want you to be a racist.
Yeah.
They might get converted.
That's there's a possibility.
There might be, something might occur that might be better. But with white liberals who dismiss the gospel altogether anyway,
right,
and are smug in their liberalness, they're the first to quickly compromise in order to get certain of their wants passed legislatively and literally throw us under the bus. And we see this happening with the President Biden administration, in where the things that are important to communities of color who turned out to vote
got them elected
for Biden. And I mean, the reason why Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency was because of communities of color have yet to see any meaningful legislation that impacts our communities in a positive way. If anything, things have gotten worse for us. So, what can I say? It's, we're damned with the Republicans and we're damned with the Democrats.
Well, and as it relates to white Christianity, it should also speak to us about who we put our faith in, right? Like, I mean, it's this notion that, I mean, if your God is a Democrat or a Republican, you're probably placing your faith in the wrong place.
Absolutely.
We also, sorry, were you about to go on or?
No, go ahead.
Cool. We also have a video of a question from someone who is a listener of the podcast that we would like to play for you, and you can answer the question that they have on the other side in, I guess, whatever language you would like.
Yeah, pick your language on this.
This is Lysandra, who's a parishioner at St. Aidan's, and she came from Cuba and as a refugee herself here to this country, and now works with immigrants and is just an incredibly faithful person. And she's a big fan of Miguel de la Torre. So she was like, oh, I wish I could be on. And I'm like, send me a video. So here it is.
Qué pena, maestro, que no pueda estar con usted esta tarde. Me hubiera encantado conocerlo, conversar con usted. Creo que ya lo conozco por todos los libros que he leído, pero el deber me llama y aquí tengo que estar trabajando y no puedo participar en la reunión. Pero sí quisiera hacerle una pregunta. Ahora lo voy a decir en español para usted porque me dijeron que así lo hiciera, y luego lo voy a hacer en inglés para los demás oyentes. Mi pregunta es, en uno de sus libros usted dijo que ignorar la historia es condenarnos a construir una nueva. ¿Qué usted cree que estamos ignorando ahora mismo? ¿Qué usted cree que estamos construyendo ahora mismo con todo lo que está pasando en el mundo? Quizás es una pregunta un poquito más filosófica que teológica, pero lo quisiera ver dentro de su punto de vista. Muchísimas gracias y que tenga una placentera tarde, y Kevin es súper estelar y el grupo también. Un abrazo.
So first, let me say un abrazo, un placer conocerla y una lástima que no puede estar aquí con nosotros. I will answer it in English only so that the listeners could also follow. That was just a personal message that I gave.
Thank you.
What she was asking is, in one of my other books, I talk about history, and that we're condemned if we ignore history. And what are we ignoring today is what she was asking. I think when we talk about history, and this is more philosophical, as she said, more philosophical than theological, and she's right. So let me be a little philosophical, if I may. All too often, by we, I'm talking about European philosophy, looks at history as a dialectical, upward linear mobility. In other words, you've heard it said, you know, in the past it was bad, it's better now, in the future it's going to get better. We're in an upward movement in history where things are getting better and better and better. Capitalism and communism are both children of modernity, in where they both have this salvation history. And by salvation, I'm not talking theological, I'm talking about reaching a historical utopia where we will all live in peace and harmony. And it's a very modernist concept. I have unfortunately drank the Foucault Kool-Aid and been impacted by postmodernist thought, in where history is not linear for me. And in fact, history becomes whatever I want history to be, by finding certain incidents in the past, linking them together to justify the present so that I can then create the future. Now, saying all that, when we ignore those stories that I do not choose to link together to justify the present, I am therefore controlling what the future would look for. So when she asked, what are we ignoring in history? Specifically, we are ignoring the voices of the marginalized of history. We are ignoring those who have been relegated to the underside of society, who don't have history. I mean, when you look at, for example, the history of this continent, it begins in 1492. Now, there might be a paragraph or two about, you know, primitive savages before we ever showed up. But for all practical purposes, history only begins when white people show up on other people's shores. Anything before that really is not history. So the post-colonial method is to recapture those stories that are dismissed by the center and make the periphery the center of our discourse. And if we can do that, we create a very different present, one in where this white Christian nationalism is an abomination rather than a God-ordained movement through history that God's hand is leading.
Right, this manifest destiny,
Exactly.
Right, one of the interesting things of watching the whole sort of rise of Donald Trump from sort of 2015 forward is just how quickly the religious right embraced him and his message, particularly given how outspoken they've been on moral issues before, whether it was Bill Clinton or anybody else that had any sort of a public display of any sinfulness. But you write in a book about how so many of them have been quick to point to Donald Trump as the modern day King Cyrus, who was a useful tool to the people of Israel. You make the case that, in fact, you believe that he's more appropriately described as, and this is important, this day and age's Antichrist. And I point that out, and you can explain more, but not the Antichrist, but the Antichrist of this day and age. Here's a quote for folks to sort of set the tone, and then maybe you can explain a little more, because I think that you can't help but listen to talk radio in the United States over the last 20 years, the Rush Limbaughs and the Glenn Becks and so on, and try and make the case that Trump is the cause of this. I think that Trump is a product of everything that's come before. So you write this: if I had drunk the dispensationalist Kool-Aid, I guess I would be batshit scared of the rise of Donald Trump, because no one in our time has better fit the description of the Antichrist than he. Fortunately, Donald Trump is not the apocalyptic Antichrist prophesied in the biblical text who will bring forth the end of the late, great planet Earth, because such a figure is simply a fictional figment of the white conservative Christian imagination. He is one of many who have arisen throughout history to lead astray those seeking the face of God. Many good-meaning whites, you write, numbly asked after Trump's electoral college victory, how could this have ever happened? Or intoned, this is not who we are as a nation. But I argue, you write, that this is exactly who we are as a nation. Trump does not exemplify the United States. In fact, he is the best example of what the United States has come to represent. Does indeed exemplify the United States. He's become the best example of what the United States has come to represent. MAGA and what would Jesus do have always been synonymous. Long before Trump ever rode down that escalator, homegrown white supremacy, sprouted from the fertile soil of the United States, and its concomitant acts of genocide were made possible through the mainstream everyday, down home, good old-fashioned Christianity of this nation. This white Christianity philosophically and theologically established the inferiority of those who fall short of whiteness so they could be replaced by those with a delusional sense of exceptionalism. Today's Antichrist is simply the culmination of a U.S. white ethno-nationalist rhetoric, a rhetoric that permits the U.S. to self-define as the exemplary nation charged with being the shining light onto a darkened world. And since you wrote this book, these people marched on the Capitol, and beat police officers, and people died. And, there's no mistake that the warnings that you actually write near the end of the book about how, God help us if he doesn't get elected, who knows where it'll be. We all got to see what it looks like, right? So I just wonder if you can say more about this, because I think sometimes, at least as we hear it on this side of the border, it's like, well, look at what Trump has done. And I think, well, I think Trump's more a product than a cause. But
no, absolutely. Trump lacks the intellectual aptitude to have changed this country to what it is today. Instead, he is the culmination of where this country has been going all along. After having a Black president, and where literally the structures of white supremacy was threatened to its core, we should not be surprised that this white lash of Trump occurred to make America great again, which is really make America white again after 8 years of the White House being occupied by a Black man.
Yep.
So that's important to begin realizing. But secondly, when I was a fundamentalist, I would read the signs of the time and try to figure out where will this Antichrist emerge and what would they be. I was always looking like towards Europe someplace. I was always looking,
I figured Canada. I think the Antichrist got to come from Canada.
But somewhere 20 years into the future, no matter what, when I was looking at this, highly influenced by the late great Planet Earth by Lindsay. I left this conservative Christianity by the time the Left Behind series came out.
Right.
So but I was very much into this. So because I'm familiar with this, these pseudo prophecies of who and what the Antichrist is supposed to be, I couldn't help but see how similar Trump was to some of these future predictions. So what I did was, in that section of the book, I went back to the late great Planet Earth, and then I read the Left Behind series, which was a challenge in and of itself. And then I took what they said the Antichrist was, and I compared it to newspaper articles about Donald Trump, where he is doing the exact same things that these dispensationalist prophets were claiming the Antichrist would do. And that's what I'm saying. If I actually believe this stuff.
Yes, he's your guy.
I would be waiting for somebody to shoot him in the head and see him be resurrected and take over the world.
That's right.
The prophecy of the Antichrist. So I just found it fascinating that the very people who have spent decades mapping out when and where the Antichrist is going to be or going to show up, failed to recognize him when this generation's Antichrist actually did show up.
Right.
Which then leads me to think that if Jesus was to ever return, this same generation of Euro Christians who's claimed to worship this Jesus will be the first to re-crucify him all over again.
Yeah, it's incredible, actually. Look, we've got lots we could go into, but the previous book to this one was Burying White Christianity. That's am I remembering that title right?
Right.
And I believe Badass is in the title of that too, right?
Right.
Listen, by the way, if you use the dictate mechanism on your word processor, as I do, which you can tell because all through the quotes it says words like quote and period, and they write it out. But you know what? It won't give you badass. It gives you a bunch of it gives you a bunch of stars. Every time I tried to say badass to the dictate thing to put the questions in, it came out with a bunch of stars. But anyway,
I'm calling Bill Gates as soon as we're done.
Call Bill Gates. Get that fixed, will you? So you
and by the way, just not to interrupt you, but I'm just about finishing the third book of that trilogy.
Okay, which is going to be?
It's going to be called Apartheid America, a badass Christian response.
Oh, geez, this is good. You're coming back. You're coming back.
He's got a theme going.
He's got it going, man. And you and remember our friend Jamie Smith, he's got the trilogies too, he writes, right? So on liturgical stuff. So that book, by the way, which I'd also recommend to people read, fantastic book, where you make the case that what needs to be rejected really are those Eurocentric lens by which Christianity is seen and defined, that we need to bury this thing, which is really, and as you point out, you're not arguing against Christianity, you're arguing against this thing that people declare as Christianity, which is about as far away from the message of Jesus as you could possibly get. Basically, you as you get to the last third of the book, it's like, no, we need to be badass Christians. We need to be badass Christians. And you liken the badass to Jonah, who was a badass with God, saying, I don't know. I don't like that. That's not where I'm going to go with this, because, these people should pay for the way they've sinned and what they've done. You lay out a framework for what a badass Christian looks like, and you say it calls for, and I'll give the list, and then maybe you can sort of expand on that for people. But you say that a badass Christianity calls for decolonization of liberating faith expression, a commitment to a racial solidarity with the oppressed, celebration of belief, rejection of laws and regulations made mainly by men, survival ethics, liberation of all, a rejection of Eurocentric theological thought, calling bullshit, that's my favorite, Also, the word processor will not let me say bullshit. And costliness. You say it's costly as a sacrifice of all. So I wonder if you can expand upon those, but be sure to include for us an explanation of, I'll probably get it wrong, but perioda, is that how do you say?
Para joder.
Perahode. It's an ethics that really what it means is to fuck with. And it definitely won't let me say that on the word processor. But this I read this in a previous book of yours I was reading about this idea of in that hopelessness book about that same theology and a theology that screws with or fucks with people who are causing this oppression. So can you say more about what this badass Christian looks like?
Well, first of all, God is not afraid of me fighting with God, pushing back on God, cursing God. God is not afraid of that. We have this image that somehow, if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to get hit by lightning. My favorite verse of the scripture is when Jacob wrestles with God in Genesis, and it says he walks away limping.
That's right.
My whole life has been fighting with God in order to see God's face like Jacob.
Wow.
And in a way, this has caused me pain.
Yes.
And I too have walked away limping. And that's okay, because that means faith is real. Right. The fact that I wrestle with God means that I actually believe I'm wrestling with something, someone. So, you know, I begin that this badass Christianity is one that truly wrestles with divinity, and because of that, refuses to play these games that we've established as to what is holy, what is pure, what is Christian. Now, this whole ethics para joder I began to develop in several books back, specifically in the one on embracing hopelessness. And again, I'm not inventing anything new. What I realize is that the oppressed of the world have always screwed with their oppressors, and have had stories of tricksters. The African American community has Bear Bear and Bear Rabbit. The indigenous communities has Coyote and Spider. Mexicans have Cantinfla. Puerto Ricans have Juan Bobo. We Cubans have Pepito. And one of the religious spirituality that has influenced me that comes from my island is this, it's called Santeria, in where you have the Orisha, Elegua, who is the trickster. Now, the reason you have tricksters is because if you come against those with power who have all the guns, you'll probably end up being either physically or economically killed.
Right.
So how do you play the fool? How do you play the jokester and say and do what needs to be done without paying the price of death in the process? Or as Jesus would say, how can we be wise as serpents but gentle as doves? So this trickster, which I also believe is strongly in the biblical text, but our Puritan background has beat it out of the text.
Right.
You know, you have Tamar, who is trying to get justice from Judah, so she pretends to be a prostitute to trick Judah into admitting that what he was doing was wrong. You have King David pretending to be crazy, playing the trickster of a mad person, so as not to be attacked by the king of the land in which he's occupying. And you know, you have Jesus. Yes. That every time somebody asked him a question, you know, do we pay taxes? He came back with a zinger. Yeah. So you have these trickster images both in the biblical text and within communities of color as a way of survival. So this ethics para joder, this ethics that, and I'll use the word screw with the system. I only curse mostly in Spanish, not in English.
I only know how to do it in English, or else I would do it in Spanish too. So.
Yeah. Read my religious book. We'll teach you how to curse in Spanish.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
But this ethics para joder, it becomes a strategy by which I learn how to steal so that I could feed the hungry. I learn how to lie so I could discover what is true. I learn how to disrupt so that I could find what the actual structures are. It is a way of surviving that, again, I'm not inventing. I'm just putting words into something that communities of color have always done, for centuries now.
Yeah, wonderful perspective. This whole hour and a bit that we've talked, Miguel, has been wonderful, and a lot of light bulb moments for me. Certainly, I know for our listeners. So we want to thank you so much for being with us. The books, folks, Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers, and Burying White Privilege. That's another one we've talked about. And I guess there were 6 this year, so we're not going to list them all, but look for Dr. De La Torre's works. And we thank you for your work, and especially for your time today and for joining us on the Vickers Crossing.
Thank you for having me. This has been a true joy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was wonderful. So thankful to meet Miguel and to hear more about his work and what he's writing. It really is eye-opening stuff. Like I said, just listening today 3 or 4 times, the light bulb goes off, right? And you see the perspective and how he contextualizes things so well. And it was really, really good to do that. So glad he could be here.
Amazing guy. And a shout out to Lizandra Hernandez, who's a member here at St. Aidan's, for bringing us a little Espanol today. And I know that you were happy to do that, Lizandra, and we're glad that you could. And I'll be interested to hear your feedback on all that.
I wonder if we started a new trend here on the Vickers Crossing. I'm seeing some possibilities.
A listener question.
A listener question. See, we have the technology. We can do it.
Yep.
Hey, thanks to our sponsors today, as always, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Thanks, guys. That's a wrap, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on the Vickers Crossing. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George, St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And Kevin, remember to always look both ways
before you cross the street, because Ian could be running across the street because he's got to pee.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!